Thank you, James, for a fascinating talk. We've got probably 20 minutes for questions. And we've got a boom mic coming around behind you. As usual, we film all of our events, so if you don't want to be on camera, then please don't ask a question. And we've got one starting here at the back.
Your world tour reminds me a little bit of Voltaire's Candide. And you remember the conclusion at the end was tend your garden. So if you bump into Maggie Thatcher, that's what you say.
Yeah.
In the USA, recently in the primary election in North Carolina, there was discussion in the audience about whether the people who were too poor and too sick, what should happen to them. And someone said, let the buggers die. And the audience cheered quite excitedly, agreeing with it. Have you detected any of this hardcore view that if you can't support yourself, too bad in the USA?
Well, I haven't yet gone to the USA to look at this specifically. I am going.
Go to North Carolina.
I will go. I've not promised to go to North Carolina, but I will. I mean, you do see the Tea Party movement. You know, from what you know as well as I do, that there is this movement of resentment and anger that people feel they're being taken for a ride, and I think that's particularly strong in the States because they were very, very slow to create a welfare state. They have created it effectively. But there was resistance to it because I think culturally they were brought up with the sense of self-reliance was important. It was good for you, sort of emotionally, morally. It was part of their idea of themselves. And every country has an idea of itself. It's obviously all of us have ideas of ourselves which often overlap. But most countries, one of the things that's interesting is that different countries have a different sort of top aspect that they think is important. And one of the big contrasts I found on countries I have visited is for Italy, so the top item is the family. That's what they think is really important. And in Sweden, the top thing was feminism and the independence of women. I was even told by one person there, we regard divorce as good because it shows the woman is independent. And so that kind of attitude frames their social legislation, just as the Italian attitude frames their legislation. And I think the American history of self-reliance is still coming through, but I do think that all the signs are that view is actually diminishing in America.
The Obama changes haven't come in yet, though.
I don't think so, but no, they're still being. In fact, they're still being argued. Some people are arguing it's still unconstitutional, I believe.
Yes.
But it's.
Yes. That's the point I'm making.
Yeah. So, but I think that the Obamacare is a symptom of the fact that America is falling into line with other countries, and that is probably the long-term process, and that one of the effects of welfare is that gradually you begin to accept it and become there's a kind of submission, and North Carolina there may be a sort of resistance to it, but I think that North Carolina will not win.
Just over here.
Good evening. One of the most pernicious things that I've seen over the last 30 or 40 years in Australia is the general change in attitude towards welfare. When I was a kid, it used to be shameful to be on welfare. Now it's something to be wrought, schemed, milked, and it's open to everybody for every reason. And I think until we change that attitude, we're going to have a massive problem because people just think it's there to be milked. But I also think that there are a number of people, particularly younger people who are, let's say, 35 to 40, who are working hard, are saying, I'm fed up with my taxes going up, and I see so many people who don't want to work, and that's okay, are provided with a house, provided with food, and provided with everything, even though they've chosen not to do anything in society.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, you just juxtapose the two things that are going on. When I think it's across the world. On the one hand, you've got people developing a sense of entitlement. I'm due this, and what's more, I'll game the system and take advantage of it. And at the same time, you've got other people who are feeling very resentful that they're being taken advantage of. And well, I mean, I suppose they're not going to meet in the street and have a clash, but it is a kind of part of the political battle. And I think that people who vote more tend to be the ones who are actually involved in society, contributing to society, The statistics show that they vote more than the disaffected, and they will vote in people and have voted in people who will make reforms. That's taking a more optimistic view than I would have previously. Yeah. Okay, yes, it's different here, but in most countries it's not compulsory.
And just before the next question, can I ask you to please project your voice loudly, because we've got a lot of people in the back. I think we had one right down the back.
Thank you. One of the criticisms of the Tea Party, I don't know if it's fair or not, is that it is a hypocritical approach. You know, cut the benefits but not my benefits. And I just wondered if you had any comments on your perceptions about that double standard. It's a version of NIMBYism, I suppose, when you're dealing with trying to reform the system.
Yeah. Well, I haven't been to the States yet, and I'm cautious to...
I'm not just mean the States, anywhere. Really.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I haven't seen many examples of that. I think most people who say this is outrageous are people who are paying very heavily in taxes and are just fed up with paying taxes and knowing. I mean, the biggest outrage, it is commonly said that in Britain, the people who are most angry about benefits are not people like me, they're not people in the media. The people who are most angry are the people next door to a guy on benefits. Yeah. So he's working hard in a job that's not well paid, and he sees next door someone who's getting a large rental allowance, because you've got a relatively modest rental allowance here, but in other countries the rental allowance can be very, very significant, and getting benefits, and they've got new trainers, and they're going on foreign holidays, they're working on the site. They are the people who get really angry.
We've got a couple over here, 1, 2, 3.
I don't quite agree with you on your supposition about the limits of democracy making it different for these to change the problem created by the welfare state. I think it's the opposite. If you look at the history of, this is how I think of it anyway, of how the welfare state began, it was Bismarckian Germany, which was not a democracy, started in Britain, when British democracy started to run into a hell of a lot of problems, which ended with the destruction of the Liberal Party and Labour-Tory politics, among other things. It's when democracy starts to ossify and run into those problems that you had the state grows at the expense of that democracy. So you can't say, oh, it's the only way to make these changes. It's not that it can't. And you can't, you say, well, politicians are always going to be opportunists and rent seek and all the rest of it. That's if you allow that to happen. It's only by renewing democracy and the party system that you can do it. Every bureaucratic method, you mentioned Poland, well, that comes from Stalinism and the bureaucracy we had retiring at 35. Or fascism, or the Bismarck state. They weren't democratic, and they're incredibly bureaucratic and welfarist. So it's only democracy. Maggie Thatcher was right. It's the only way to do it. So you fight them on every conceivable thing that comes up. We've had this pokey tax thing here in Australia. It's terrific. You think this is about nothing, but it's not. It's about people being able to develop their own vices, you know, like drinking and smoking and gambling. And it's wonderful. We won.
Well, I'd love to think that you were right. I mean, I've actually looked at some of the history of democracy and the introduction of welfare states in various countries. I can't give you the statistics now or the figures now, but I can remember that for the UK. In 1834, there was concern that there was, in Britain, there was concern that there was lone parenting, and that people were unemployed because they were on benefit, and that employers were using a kind of tax credit, extra payment to low-paid workers to exploit them and to exploit the system. The result was this Royal Commission decided that they should make benefits less attractive, that you should only get benefits if you went to a workhouse, and that you should not get benefits for staying at home. And so conditions were dramatically toughened up. And I've been to one of the workhouses that still remains as a National Trust relic. the conditions were made much tougher. Later in the same century, the democracy, the franchise was dramatically increased. And then it was increased to all men, I think, and not women, but it was all men, I think, before 1911, which was the key date. And in 1911, the Liberals were reacting to a strong, what they perceived as a strong communist threat. The rise of the Labour Party was happening. It hadn't got big, but the writing was on the wall that the Labour Party was going to rise. The Liberals, and Lloyd George went over to Germany to look at the Bismarckian system, and Churchill at the time wrote that, words to the effect that the person who makes a social insurance system in the UK will do a great thing. And for them, it was a way of staying in power. They could see the writing on the wall and they were responding to it. That's when the modern welfare state in Britain was created, and it was a response to democratic pressure. And I think that Poland, you may have a point, that was a communist time and not a democratic, but there was popular pressure, and there was pressure. I mean, this was a real case of the public servants feathering their own nests. Because these are obviously the soldiers, and these were interest groups which those in power did not feel so secure, because Poland wasn't quite as dictatorial as communist Soviet Union, and so those in power were trying to maintain power, and were trying to get on side the army and the police. But I think in other countries, the norm is that you develop and this happened in Germany. I think the figures for when democracy came in Germany supports this. Democracy tends to be the precursor to the introduction of welfare states. I'm sorry I can't give you the figures, because that's not the talk I came to give. But, anyway, I wish you were right. And I hope that you're right about the capacity of democracies to reform.
You talked about a lot of ills attributable to the welfare state in Britain. But let's look at America, which is a country which is ideologically opposed to helping the poor and the downtrodden and the unfortunate. In America, you have the same conditions you talked about in Britain. There is widespread teenage pregnancy, illiteracy, the jails are overflowing, there's a huge male feral population, high unemployment,
etc., etc.
And where healthcare is rationed by ability to pay rather than need. I don't think it can be attributed to a welfare state, because America is ideologically opposed to helping, to being a welfare state.
Yeah.
The cause could be even earlier up, higher up, and that is to the malfunction of democracy, where politicians pander to the electorate and also to special interest groups, to big business, for example, the wealthy elite.
But all these can be traced back to Johnson's Great Society. Really,
well, exactly. I think you're quite right that ideologically, America is against the welfare state. In reality, it has one. The reality is they have government schooling, which is often terrible, and illiteracy in America is a major problem, and I put that down to the government schooling. Secondly, they do have welfare benefits, major welfare benefits, and that's why they had Clinton signed the Welfare Reform Bill in 1997, because they had such major problems with welfare benefits.
But
so
try being sick and poor in America.
Yeah. I'm afraid they had welfare benefits, and those are part of the reason why they have had the unemployment, why they've had the lone parenting, because they do have these benefits. I mean, I know people have this idea about America that it's the capitalists red in tooth and nail, but it is not. It has 40%, even before Obama, 40% of healthcare in America is paid for by the government, not by individuals. People, I don't wish to include you, but people have some ideas that because the ideology and ideas of America are ruthlessly capitalist, it actually lives that way. It doesn't live that way. It has a massive welfare state.
I think it's worth adding that I think 46 million people in the United States get food stamps every month.
Yeah. food stamps part of it, yeah.
We just had one more here that we had lined up. I'll let you answer and then we'll
Do you think there's a welfare state becomes particularly problematic when society becomes more heterogeneous? It seems like people will don't mind paying for welfare for people who are like them, but as soon as you start getting, you get this. I remember living in UK, and there was the image that the Pakistanis were coming in and abusing the welfare, and that's when it really started getting a bad name. It's just when people who aren't like you start claiming it that it really becomes becomes an issue.
I think that can affect, at the tabloid level, that can be a potent factor. If you have somebody who's a recent immigrant who came over here and works the system, then people get irritated by that because they're not very keen on having that immigrant coming in anyway. And then if that person is then ripping off a system, has never worked here, has never contributed, they find that pretty irritating. Yeah. But on the other hand, I think that the situation where people get really angry is the situation I described earlier, where it actually is someone like them who is ripping off a system that is most irritating to them.
Well, it seemed to work with Denmark and places like that. I mean, people were happy with it. Maybe it wasn't working, but people were still happy with it because it was a very small, homogeneous society.
I noticed a bit of what you're saying in Sweden, where it was said that because they were used to be a very unified society, and then it took in a lot of immigrants fairly recently, and those ones tend to be the ones who are now on benefits, and they are identified as being sort of the benefit claimants. And that probably has contributed to giving them a rethink on welfare.
Okay, we've got one here and then one at the back, and then I'm sorry, I know that there's lots of questions, but we're...
Thank you for a wonderful talk. My question really is about what constitutes a welfare? Because from what you talked about, it looks like it is the unemployment benefit or the free health, etc. But how about the subsidies that are given to, for example, rich farmers in US, the export enhancement, and also the rich farmers in Europe? Now, isn't that also a welfare? And in that case, shouldn't you also include that in your discussion?
Look, I am dealing with welfare around the world in every aspect. I'm not going to include farming.
Well, they do get subsidies. They are very rich. It is welfare.
I'm not saying it's not a scandal. It may be a scandal. I mean, I'm in favour of free trade and no subsidies for anything.
I mean, the European farmers.
But I will let other people deal with that one.
that is what my question. Why are you not dealing with it?
Because I'm talking about societal change. If farmers get a bit of extra money, then it may be a bad thing, but it's not corrupting the entire society. That's what the welfare business is doing.
Yes.
Yeah. Look, I'm on your side in this, for God's sake. I've been arguing in the British press and the.
I was quite interested to hear you saying about the farmers getting a bit of extra money. You didn't say that they are getting dole or they're getting benefit. You used the word a bit of extra money.
Ah, yes. Oh, got me there.
Can I just challenge your thinking on a couple of things? I think you're right about the concept of benefits for not working. However, there's a difference between a healthcare system which is provided for free and an education system which is provided for free, which I actually think often can be a good thing, particularly for the most disadvantaged. The reality of what you've presented is actually they happen to be very badly provided in the UK and the US. And absolutely, I personally believe free enterprise would be a much better way to go, and choice would be a better way to go. And one of the issues that the welfare system or the freedom system has created is actually, it's about government provision versus free choice. And where disadvantaged people suffer most is they have no choice in terms of an education system or a healthcare system. So I think that's one issue you raise. I have to say on the unemployment side of things and the benefit side of things, probably the worst thing we ever did was pay people to sit at home and do nothing. Now, not that I would say we should go back to the workhouses. However, there has to be responsibility that comes with the payment of some form of benefit. And I think we failed there. But I think that's different between providing education, providing free healthcare where it's needed. And equally, I think there's a responsibility, like in Italy, for families to pay the cost of meeting those things. And one of the issues that we also face is we, the middle class, actually like our free benefits as well, and don't necessarily want to pay for our parents or for our own healthcare. And perhaps there's a challenge for us to say, well, if we want to see change, we may need to put our hands up and meet some of our own costs as well.
Yeah, and the way that, I mean, I agree with virtually everything you say. The way that you persuade people to take more responsibility is by seeing them get an advantage from it. If you can get people involved in the system, I mean, I've only been here for 24 hours, and so in a jet-lagged state, I've listened to some people, but it seemed to me the compulsory savings with discretion over where that saving is done gives people a certain amount of choice and allows them to buy into a system which may stop them becoming welfare dependent in old age, in due course. And you talk about choice and competition. I think if you're going to have a welfare state, and you're going to, and I accept this is inevitable, then in health and education there is a big place for choice and competition, for driving down waste. And the waste in state organizations cannot be underestimated. In fact, not enough work is done on the amount of waste. I know that it was difficult for me to find out how many people are involved in education in Britain, because the central government employs people who are improving our education, the local government have people who are improving our education, and then of course you have the actual schools. It was difficult to find out the figures, but it seems that if you added together all the people in local education or government, let's say not actually at the school, and those in the central government, and those in the quangos, which are inspecting them, and so on and so forth, for every teacher in every school, there is a bureaucrat next door, an invisible bureaucrat. And the same goes for healthcare, where the overstaffing and waste in the government hospitals is horrendous.
I was just curious, extending from that, if you'd considered a debt model for welfare. If you look at the baby bonus, you look at a childcare rebate, and the argument is, well, people need money when they have a kid. Fine, take it, but you're paying it back one day. And wouldn't that pare things back, that if you know you're paying it back, you're not going to take it in the first place? I was just curious if you'd considered that.
I hadn't considered it, but I'll think about it now. One of the things that's interesting there, I think the Australian experience may be a bit similar to the UK. Certainly I've found that actually lots of things that happened here are very similar to things that have happened in the UK. What used to be the case in Britain was that you didn't get, now you get a sort of a child benefit, it's called, child benefit. So you have a child, you get money automatically, cash, given to the mother, in fact. But what existed previously was that you had a tax allowance. So you didn't get it cash, but you could keep more of your money that you earned. So this actually created a situation where it encouraged people to work if they were going to have children. It didn't say, okay, we pay you to have children. It basically says, we will relieve some of the taxation from you, from your work, when you have children. And so it used to be the case that immediately after the war, despite the fact we had gigantic debts and very high rates of tax, that if you were a person on an average income, then you, with 2 children married, you would pay no income tax. And that, nowadays, tax goes down to the people who are, the government defines people as being in poverty and still taxes them. So the difference is gigantic.
Thank you. I found your analysis fascinating. I wonder what you make of such think tanks as Res Publica and similar groups that offer an analysis that it's not so much the welfare state by itself, but the welfare state plus the decline in traditional social and moral values across the board and related institutions such as the church and particularly education, both in university level and in schooling.
Well, I mean, sticking to just one part of what you said, I would suggest the change in... People sometimes argue, oh, well, the welfare state had to change because society was changing. I would argue that the welfare state caused a great deal of that change. Not all of it, but a great deal of it. And so the causation, we're arguing about which was the chicken and which was the egg. And I think it's the other way around from them.
All right.
Well, we're going to have to finish up. I know there's lots more questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time. I was given very specific instructions to go into one of the offices and get a gift to give you, and I left it in that office. So you will be getting a thank you present, but I don't have it on me right now. Look, please join me in thanking James. That was a really fascinating.